My son gifted me a luxury trip to Cambodia. You deserve to relax, Dad, he said with a warm smile. But minutes after he dropped me off at the airport, a gaunt stranger stopped me. Do not get on that plane, he whispered. I just heard your son on the phone. I froze, and what he said next shocked me to my core. My name is Victor Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you are watching from today. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever been pushed to your absolute limit by the people you trusted most. It was a brisk Tuesday morning at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Terminal 5 was a chaotic sea of rolling suitcases, shouting cab drivers and rushing travelers. I stood on the curb, the biting Illinois wind tugging at my heavy winter coat, looking at my 38-year-old son, Derek. He looked like the absolute picture of modern success. He wore a custom-tailored gray suit, a ridiculously expensive watch, and leaned casually against his sleek black Porsche. You are going to have the time of your life, Dad, Derek said, pulling me into a tight, seemingly affectionate embrace. 3 whole weeks in Cambodia. A premium spiritual retreat. You earned this. After everything you did for us, you finally get to rest. I smiled and patted his shoulder, feeling a deep swell of paternal pride. I had spent 40 years building a commercial real estate empire right here in Chicago from the dirt up. I started with nothing but a rusted cement mixer and a pair of worn-out steel-toed boots. My hands are still rough, permanently calloused, from decades of tying cold rebar and pouring concrete in the freezing Midwestern winters. I built an $18 million fortune so my son would never have to break his back the way I did. When Derek and his wife Monica handed me this first-class ticket, I truly thought it was their way of showing gratitude. I thought I had raised a good man. Have a safe flight, Dad. Love you, he called out, sliding into the driver's seat of his sports car. The powerful engine roared, and the Porsche melted quickly into the dense airport traffic. I grabbed the handle of my luggage, taking a deep breath of the freezing air, ready to walk through the automatic sliding glass doors toward the check-in counters. But before I could take a second step, a man stepped directly into my path, completely blocking my way. He was tall, gaunt, and his face was severely weathered. He wore a faded brown trench coat. He was lighting a cigarette, his eyes darting around nervously before locking directly onto mine. "Excuse me, do you have a light?" I asked politely, trying to step around him. He did not move. He stepped closer, invading my personal space. The harsh smell of cheap tobacco and stale coffee hit my face. "Do not get on that plane," he whispered. His voice was completely flat, devoid of any emotion but deadly serious. I frowned, tightening my grip on my heavy suitcase. "I do not know who you are, buddy, but you need to step aside right now." He shook his head, his eyes burning with an intense urgency that made me stop. "Listen to me," he hissed. "I was standing right behind that concrete pillar when your son walked back to his car. I heard him on the phone. He said the old man is past security. Cancel his premium health insurance and trigger the POA. He is never coming back. POA, power of attorney." Those 3 words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. A normal 70-year-old man might have stumbled backward. He might have gasped or started crying out in disbelief right there on the sidewalk. But you do not survive 4 decades negotiating with cutthroat construction contractors and ruthless city inspectors by losing your head in a crisis. My rough hands squeezed the handle of my luggage so hard my knuckles turned totally white. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, echoing in my ears, but externally my face turned to absolute stone. I stared at the stranger, my mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Why would my son say that? Why would he cancel my health insurance right, as I am flying to a developing country in Southeast Asia? And why on earth would he trigger the power of attorney now? My memory instantly flashed back to last month. I had suffered a minor health scare. It was just a slight dizzy spell brought on by high blood pressure, but I spent 1 night in the hospital for observation. Derek and Monica had rushed to my bedside in a total panic. They cried. They held my hand. They played the role of the devoted, terrified children perfectly. A few days later, Derek showed up at my lake house with a thick stack of legal papers. It is just to update your tax files, Dad, he had told me with that same warm, convincing smile he used today. We need to get ahead of the new Illinois estate tax penalty. My lawyer said if we do not sign these updates, the state will take half your savings if anything happens to you. It is just a precaution so you can enjoy your retirement in peace. It was a completely plausible lie. It made perfect financial sense. I signed them. I trusted my own flesh and blood. I gave him the very knife he was now plunging deep into my back. I looked at the gaunt man standing in front of me. He took a long drag of his cigarette, blowing the smoke into the freezing wind. I do not know what kind of sick game your kid is playing, the stranger said quietly. But I have been around long enough to know exactly what a setup looks like. You get on a flight for 20 hours, completely disconnected from the world. By the time you land, your life here is gone. Or worse. I analyzed the man's face. He did not look like a crazy person asking for spare change. He had the sharp, calculating eyes of someone who had seen the darkest sides of human nature. The cold wind whipped around us as cars honked, and passengers hurried past, completely oblivious to the fact that my entire reality was crumbling on the concrete sidewalk. I needed to verify this. I could not just accuse my only child based on the paranoid words of a total stranger at Terminal 5. I pulled my smartphone from my coat pocket. My thumb hovered over Derek's contact name. A furious part of me wanted to call him right then and there. I wanted to scream through the phone demand to know what he was doing to his father. But the cold, calculating business owner inside me took over. If I confronted him now and he was guilty, he would give me another plausible lie. I would just be giving him a head start to cover his tracks. Instead, I opened my central banking application. The screen loaded the little circle spinning for a few agonizing seconds. I was checking my primary trust account, the one holding the bulk of my $18 million liquid fortune. The screen flashed. A bright red error message appeared across the display. Access denied. Account frozen due to authorized requests from primary power of attorney. Please contact your branch administrator. I stopped breathing. The freezing air simply left my lungs. The digital text stared back at me, mocking my years of hard work, mocking every single sacrifice I made for my family. My son had not even waited for my plane to take off the runway. The very moment my back was turned, he legally erased my financial existence. I was standing at the busiest airport in the country, holding a luxury boarding pass, and legally, I was completely penniless. The stranger tossed his cigarette onto the concrete and crushed it slowly under his heavy boot. So he said, reading the silent, devastating horror on my face, "Am I crazy, or is your kid a monster?" I slowly lowered my phone and slid it back into my pocket. The betrayal tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. My son was trying to bury me alive. But he had made one massive, fatal mistake. He assumed that because I was old, because I had retired to a quiet lake house, that my fangs had fallen out. He forgot who built the empire he was trying to steal. I turned to look through the massive glass doors of the terminal. Inside, the large digital departure board glowed with bright yellow letters. Flight 802 to Siem Reap, boarding in 2 hours. My bags were packed. The first-class ticket was fully paid for. I looked back at the stranger. He was my only witness, my only warning. Does a man board a plane knowing he is flying blindly into a trap? Or does he turn around and declare absolute war on his own blood? "What is your name?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "Garrett," he replied, crossing his arms against the cold. I reached into my inner coat pocket. Derek had successfully frozen my bank accounts, but he did not know about the $10,000 in emergency cash I always carried in my concealed money belt. An old habit from dealing with shady suppliers. I pulled out a thick stack of crisp $100 bills. "Garrett," I said, looking him dead in the eye, "I will give you $5,000 right now if you walk me to your car and drive me out of this airport before anyone sees me." He looked at the cash, then up at my face. He nodded slowly, recognizing the look of a man who had nothing left to lose, As we walked briskly away from the terminal, stepping into the shadows of the parking garage, I did not look back at the departure board. My luxury spiritual retreat was officially over, but my son's living nightmare was just about to begin. The concrete floor of the parking garage was freezing beneath my boots. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the damp walls. Garrett walked a few paces ahead of me, his trench coat billowing slightly in the drafty air. He led me toward a battered sedan, parked in the far corner of level 3. I kept my pace steady, breathing in the scent of exhaust fumes and old engine oil. It was a smell I knew well. It reminded me of the early days back when my real estate business was nothing more than a rusted pickup truck and a notebook full of dreams. But right now, that smell anchored me to reality. I needed to be absolutely certain before I unleashed a war that would burn my family tree to the ash it apparently was. I stopped next to a concrete pillar. Garrett paused, looking back at me with those sharp, weathered eyes. "Give me a minute," I said. My voice was steady, but my mind was spinning through 1,000 different scenarios. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I stared at the screen for a moment, letting the cold wind bite at my knuckles. I tapped the phone icon and scrolled down to Derek's name. I pressed call. I brought the phone to my ear, listening to the hollow ringtone. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. My heart beat heavily against my ribs. I needed to hear his voice. I needed to hear the exact tone he would use with a man he believed was currently walking into a steel tube headed across the globe. Dad, Derek answered. His voice was bright, energetic, and completely laced with that familiar corporate charm he used to close deals. "Hey, I thought you would be at the boarding gate by now. Is everything okay? Did you forget something in the car?" The sheer normalcy of his tone made my stomach churn. I forced my vocal cords to relax. I painted a smile onto my face even though there was no one there to see it. "Everything is fine, son," I replied, keeping my words slow and deliberate. "I am just grabbing a coffee before I head through the security checkpoint. I wanted to call and thank you again for this trip. It means a lot to me. And I wanted to check if there was any mail I needed to forward to my attorney before I lose cell service." "Oh, do not worry about a thing," Dad, Derek said smoothly. He did not skip a single beat. "I took care of that last batch of paperwork for you. I am just making sure your tax files are completely updated while you are in the air. We really need to avoid that new Illinois estate tax penalty we talked about. You know how aggressive the state can be with asset transfers. I have got it all handled on my end. You just focus on relaxing, okay? Have a safe flight." "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, son," I said. I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. The silence of the parking garage pressed down on me. I stood there staring at the black screen of my phone. The lie was absolutely flawless. It was plausible, logical, and delivered with the practiced ease of a man who felt zero remorse. The tax files, the Illinois estate tax penalty. My mind violently jerked backward, pulling up a memory from exactly 5 weeks ago. I had been lying in a sterile white hospital room at Chicago Medical Center. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor had filled the air. It was a minor scare, just a sudden spike in blood pressure that caused me to faint during a morning walk. The doctors had told me I just needed rest and a better diet. But Derek and Monica had rushed into that hospital room acting as if I were on my deathbed. They had hovered over me, their faces masks of sheer panic. 2 days after I was discharged, while I was still feeling tired and heavily medicated, Derek came to my house. He brought a thick leather binder filled with documents. He sat at my kitchen table, pouring me a cup of tea, looking at me with those earnest, worried eyes. "Dad," he had said, placing a pen in my hand. "You scared us. We need to be smart about your assets. The state is changing the tax laws next month. If we do not sign these updates to the trust, they could freeze your accounts or take a massive cut if your health gets worse. It is just a precaution. Let me handle the heavy lifting so you do not have to stress." I had looked at the stacks of paper. The dense legal jargon blurred together. My head was pounding from the medication. I had built a massive commercial real estate empire because I knew how to read contracts, how to spot the hidden traps in zoning permits and loan agreements. I never signed anything without reading every single clause. But this was my son. This was the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy whose college tuition I had paid in full. I had trusted him implicitly. I signed where he pointed. Page after page, signature after signature. Standing in the freezing airport garage, the truth hit me with the force of a wrecking ball. Those were not tax updates. He had brought me a durable power of attorney. He had brought me documents that legally handed over my entire estate, my financial autonomy, and my medical decisions directly to him. He had capitalized on my moment of physical weakness to strip me of my power. And he did it while pouring me a cup of tea. A sick, heavy feeling settled deep in my gut. The kind of feeling you get when you step onto a rotten floorboard and realize there is nothing beneath you but a fatal drop. Garrett was watching me quietly. He did not rush me. He leaned against the hood of his sedan, arms crossed, waiting for the reality to fully set in. I needed absolute proof. A spoken threat overheard by a stranger and a suspicious phone call were enough to ignite my rage, but I operated on facts. I unlocked my phone again. My fingers felt strangely numb as I tapped the icon for my primary wealth management bank. This was the central hub of my life's work. The account held the $18 million in liquid funds I had secured after selling my development company. It was my safety net, my legacy, the absolute sum of my 40 years of sweat and sacrifice. The app prompted me for my facial recognition. The green circle spun on the screen. It felt like it was spinning for an eternity. I waited for the familiar dashboard to load, for the reassuring green numbers to appear, confirming that my money was exactly where I left it. Instead, the screen flashed gray. A stark red notification box popped up in the center of the display. Access denied. This account has been frozen due to the activation of a primary power of attorney. All funds and administrative privileges have been legally transferred to the designated proxy. Please contact your branch administrator for further assistance. I stared at the glowing letters until they burned into my retinas. I closed the app and opened my secondary checking account. Access denied. I opened my investment portfolio portal. Access denied. I opened my credit card application. Account suspended. The digital wall had slammed down on me with terrifying speed. Derek had not waited a single day. He had not even waited for my plane to leave American airspace. The absolute second he dropped me off at the departure curb, he made the call. He executed the legal strike with military precision. He locked me out of my own life. I slowly lowered the phone. The screen faded to black, reflecting my own harsh, tired face in the glass. I was a man who had built skyscrapers. I had negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I had survived recessions, market crashes, and ruthless competitors. Yet I had been completely dismantled by the boy who carried my last name. I looked down at the expensive leather shoes on my feet, the tailored winter coat on my shoulders, and the rolling suitcase sitting beside me on the concrete. They were nothing but props now. Props for a dead man. If I had walked onto that flight to Cambodia, I would have landed in a foreign country with no access to cash, no credit cards, and a canceled premium health insurance policy. I would have been an old man stranded 10,000 miles from home, completely erased from the system. I looked up at Garrett. The investigator gave me a grim, knowing nod. He understood exactly what that hollow look on my face meant. He took it all I said. My voice was no longer trembling. It was dead calm. Garrett opened the passenger door of his beat-up sedan. "Then we better get moving," he said. "Because right now, you are a ghost." I climbed into the passenger seat, clutching my phone and the remaining cash in my pocket. The engine sputtered to life and we drove down the spiraling concrete ramp of the parking structure, leaving Terminal 5 behind. I was legally penniless, stripped of my life's work, and betrayed by my only child. But Derek was about to learn a very hard lesson. He had taken my money, but he had forgotten to take my mind. And I was going to use it to tear his world apart. Garrett's sedan squealed down the damp ramp. The broken heater blew cold air on my knees. I stared at the smartphone in my hand. The black screen was a useless slab locking me out of my life. A chilling realization struck me. The screen was dead, but the hardware lived. Derek was meticulous. He ran his hedge fund with paranoid surveillance. He would never execute a hostile takeover of my estate without ensuring his target was permanently removed. He bought the ticket and drove me here. But he would never leave the confirmation to chance. "Stop the car," I ordered. Garrett glanced in the rear view. "We are almost at the toll booths, Caldwell." "Pull over now," I demanded, pointing toward a maintenance alcove. "If I leave with my phone, Derek will know I never boarded. He tracks my location through a family application. It was a digital leash. If my signal heads toward Chicago instead of the Pacific Ocean, he will realize his plan failed. He will scramble his assets and hire lawyers before I can strike back." Garrett hit the brakes. The sedan jerked into the alcove hidden from traffic. He shifted into park and looked at me. "What is your move?" he asked. "If you destroy the phone, the signal vanishes. He will know something went wrong." "He does not need to look for me," I said, unbuckling my seatbelt and opening the door. "I am going to make sure he watches me fly away. Keep the engine running. I will be back in 4 minutes." I stepped into the freezing wind and hurried toward the entrance. My mind was clear. I pushed through the glass doors and blended into the mass of travelers. Terminal 5 was a sprawling maze of confused tourists and exhausted commuters. I needed a target fast. I stood right near the international security checkpoint. I scanned the crowd, watching the flow of people feeding into the lines. Then I saw him. He was a young man struggling to balance a canvas backpack while holding a coffee cup. The side pocket of his backpack was unzipped and hanging open. An orange luggage tag dangling from the top handle caught my eye. It displayed his destination: Siem Reap, Cambodia. He was boarding my flight. I pulled my smartphone from my coat. I ensured the location services were broadcasting. I slipped the device into my sleeve, hiding it against my wrist. I merged into the dense crowd, timing my approach. I walked briskly, mimicking a traveler running late. As I closed the distance, a family pushing a luggage cart abruptly stopped in the walkway. The young backpacker sidestepped to avoid them, losing his balance for a second. It was the perfect diversion. I bumped my shoulder firmly against his. "Excuse me, son," I said, reaching out to steady his arm. "I am rushing to catch my gate." "No worries, man," he replied, distracted as he located his passport. In that single second of contact, my calloused hand darted out. I smoothly dropped the smartphone directly into the gaping side pocket of his backpack. The heavy device slid deep into the fabric, swallowed by a tangle of charging cables. "Have a great trip," I said, giving a polite nod before melting into the crowd. I did not look back. Within the hour, that young man would walk onto Flight 802. When the plane took off, my phone would go dark over the Pacific Ocean. Derek would watch my digital ghost leave American soil, believing his father was gone forever. He would lower his defenses. He would celebrate his victory. And he would have no idea I was still in Chicago, preparing to tear his empire to the ground. I burst back through the exit doors, the freezing wind biting at my face, and hurried toward the idling sedan. I slid into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut. Garrett put the car in drive and pulled away. "Did you do it?" he asked. "My phone is currently going through international security," I replied. "Derek will see the location update in 5 minutes. As far as the world is concerned, Victor Caldwell is flying to Southeast Asia." I reached under my winter coat and accessed the hidden money belt strapped against my waist. I pulled out the banded stack of $100 bills. I quickly counted out 50 crisp bills. I turned to Garrett and placed the massive stack of cash directly onto the center console. "I told you I would give you $5,000 to get me out of here undetected," I said. "Take it. That is your retainer. You said you used to be an undercover cop. You said you were tracking a money laundering ring connected to my son. I need an ally who knows how the shadows of this city operate. I need a man who is not afraid to dig through the dirt to find the truth. I am hiring you. If you help me dismantle his operation and reclaim my life, I will double that payment." Garrett glanced at the enormous stack of cash on the console. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. He did not say a single word, but he gave a sharp, definitive nod. He picked up the cash, shoved it into his coat pocket, and pressed his foot heavily on the gas pedal. The engine roared as we accelerated away from the parking structure. We merged onto the outer lanes of the departure concourse, surrounded by a chaotic swarm of taxicabs and airport shuttles. The gray sky was heavy with the promise of a winter storm. As we drove past the glass windows of Terminal 5, I instinctively turned to look back at the entrance. The sliding doors were swallowing hundreds of travelers, but one figure standing near the curb completely froze the blood in my veins. It was a man in a tailored dark suit. He was broad-shouldered with a thick neck and an unsmiling face. He stood out from the casual crowd. He had a coiled earpiece tucked discreetly into his right ear. He was holding a tablet, aggressively scanning the faces of every elderly man walking into the building. He was comparing travelers to an image on his screen. He was not airport security. He was a corporate fixer, or perhaps something more dangerous. Derek had sent someone to visually confirm I entered the security checkpoint. My son was not taking any chances. The man suddenly stopped scanning the crowd. He turned his head slowly, his cold eyes sweeping over the lines of departing vehicles. For one terrifying fraction of a second, his gaze locked onto the passenger window of Garrett's battered sedan. "Drive," I commanded, sinking lower into my seat to hide my face in the shadows. "Drive the car right now." Garrett did not ask questions. He swerved the sedan aggressively into the far left lane, cutting off a blaring bus, and slammed the accelerator to the floor. We merged onto the dark interstate highway, leaving the airport, and the man in the dark suit far behind us in the rearview mirror. We had finally escaped. But the real war for my survival had only just begun. We drove in heavy, suffocating silence for 45 minutes. I directed him to pull into an electronics retailer off the highway. I walked inside, keeping my coat collar up against the biting cold. Using cash from my money belt, I purchased a prepaid laptop, a burner phone, and a hotspot. I paid the weary cashier in cash, walked back into the freezing wind, and got into the car. 10 minutes later, Garrett pulled into the lot of a roadside motel. The neon sign above the office buzzed with a flickering red light. I paid for 3 nights. We walked up the stairs to a room on the second floor. The door stuck, so I shoved it open. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and pine. The floral bedspreads were faded, but it was completely off the grid. It was the war room. I dropped my coat and booted the laptop on the desk. Before I connected to the secure network, I turned around to face the man who had just saved my life. Garrett was standing by the window, peering through a crack in the blackout curtains. I crossed my arms. "We are completely off the radar now," I said. My voice was steady, echoing in the room. "But I do not work with blindfolds on." "You recognized my son at the airport terminal. Who exactly are you, Garrett? And why are you involved in my private family business?" He dropped the curtain and turned to face me directly. The overhead light highlighted the tired lines etched into his face. He sighed, pulling out a battered wallet and tossing a metal badge onto the desk. "I was an undercover detective for the Chicago Police Department," Garrett explained. "I worked financial crimes and infiltrated organized syndicates. I took my pension early and transitioned into private intelligence. 6 months ago, a wealthy client hired me to trace a massive sum of missing offshore capital. That twisted money trail led me directly to the glass front doors of your son's luxury hedge fund in the city." I listened, absorbing every word. Garrett stepped closer, deliberately lowering his voice. "Derek is not just playing fast and loose with standard corporate funds, Victor. He is washing dirty money. I have been tailing him for weeks, trying to find the missing link that ties his clean corporate image to the violent cartel pulling his strings. I followed him to the airport this morning, hoping to catch a cash drop-off or a secret meeting. Instead, I watched him hug his father goodbye, walk behind a concrete pillar, and call his financial fixer to steal your entire life savings. I knew right then that your fortune was the final piece of his desperate puzzle." I stood completely still in the cheap motel room. The information clicked into place with horrifying clarity. My son had not simply made a bad investment in the stock market. He had intertwined his life with violent criminals, and he was intentionally using my clean real estate fortune to balance his bloody ledger. I turned my back to Garrett and opened the cheap laptop. I connected to the mobile hotspot and navigated to a highly encrypted communication platform. I had spent long decades dealing with high-stakes commercial real estate negotiations, fending off corporate espionage, and aggressively protecting my assets from greedy competitors. I knew exactly how to establish a truly secure digital line. I dialed the direct unlisted number of Preston Cole. Preston was an absolute shark in a tailored suit. He had been my primary attorney for 15 years. He was absolutely ruthless, brilliantly cunning, and fiercely loyal to the man who signed his massive retainer checks. The line clicked and connected. "This is Preston Cole," a crisp, authoritative voice finally answered. "Preston, it is Victor Caldwell speaking," I said. My tone was purely business, completely stripping away any trace of the profound emotional shock I was feeling. "Do not speak. Just listen to my instructions. I need you to quietly confirm the current status of my primary trust and all holding accounts immediately." There was a sharp, undeniably loud, stunned intake of breath on the other end of the line. Victor Preston asked, his normally unflappable professional composure cracking instantly. "What are you talking about? Are you still inside the United States? Where exactly are you calling me from right now?" "I am entirely secure," I replied smoothly. "Why are you asking me that specific question?" Preston hesitated for a fraction of a second, the rapid sound of furious keyboard typing echoing clearly through the small speaker. "Victor Derrick sent me an encrypted email just over an hour ago. He attached a legally binding, fully notarized declaration. The official email stated that you had experienced a sudden spiritual awakening during your travels. It said you discarded your phone, cut all earthly ties, and retreated indefinitely to a remote, utterly silent monastery deep in the mountains of Cambodia. It stated you had enacted the durable power of attorney, handing him absolute, immediate, and permanent control of your entire estate. The sheer audacity of the lie was truly breathtaking. Derrick had painted a flawless masterpiece of legal deception. He cleverly used my own wealth to fund the very exotic trip that would serve as my permanent alibi for disappearing from society. I am sitting in a cheap motel room in the Chicago suburbs. "Preston," I said coldly, my grip tightening on the edge of the desk. "My son is currently attempting a hostile takeover of my life. Tell me the exact legal status of my money right now." The typing on the other end of the line grew incredibly frantic. "Victor, this legal document was absolutely airtight. It possessed your verified digital signature, the exact secure one you always use for corporate approvals. Because the power of attorney was enacted under emergency absence protocols, your primary banks complied immediately. The accounts are completely frozen to your personal access." I ground my teeth together. "What is his next move?" Preston let out a heavy, shaking breath. "I am looking at the internal banking ledger right now. Derrick has already initiated a massive wire transfer. He is aggressively attempting to liquidate your primary stock portfolios and funnel the entire $18 million into an anonymous offshore holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. Because of the extreme unusual size of the transaction, the strict federal banking regulations require a mandatory holding period to verify international financial clearance." I stared at the peeling wallpaper of the damp motel room, my mind calculating the horrific mathematics of my survival. "How long, Preston? How long do we have until that massive sum of money finally clears the border?" Preston's deep voice was absolutely deadly serious, devoid of any legal posturing. 72 hours, Victor. The holding period officially expires at noon on Friday. We have exactly less than 72 hours to file a federal injunction, halt the wire transfer, and physically prove you are still alive. If that digital clock runs out, the money crosses international waters permanently. It vanishes entirely into the dark web forever, and you will be legally, completely, and permanently broke without any legal recourse. I ended the call with Preston and closed the burner laptop. The silence in the cheap motel room was absolute and entirely deafening. 72 hours. That was the exact lifespan of my entire legacy. Derek had moved with the ruthless efficiency of a corporate raider, utilizing the very legal structures I had built to protect my family to completely annihilate me. Garrett was standing quietly by the window, watching my reaction in the dim light. I did not panic or shed a single tear. Panic is a useless luxury afforded only to people who have someone coming to save them. I had spent my adult life relying solely on myself, negotiating hostile buyouts and crushing rival developers who mistakenly thought they could outsmart me. I stood up slowly and grabbed my heavy winter coat from the back of the faded floral chair. "We need physical evidence," I told Garrett. "Financial records, falsified documents, and digital wire transfers can easily be disputed by high-priced defense attorneys in a drawn-out courtroom battle. I need to know exactly who my son is working for and what his next move is before that clock hits 0. We are going to his house." Garrett raised a highly skeptical eyebrow. "You mean your house," he corrected. "The lake house. Breaking in there is a massive risk right now. If he activated a smart security system, the local police will be there in 3 minutes." I shook my head, slipping my arms into my heavy coat. "He did not build that massive house. I did. We are leaving at 2 in the morning. At 2 in Troon." At exactly 2 in the morning, Garrett turned his battered sedan onto the dark, winding, tree-lined road leading toward the wealthy northern suburbs. The frozen lake was a vast, terrifying expanse of pitch-black water against the starless winter sky. The lake house sat at the very end of a private, isolated cul-de-sac. It was a massive $4 million architectural masterpiece of imported stone-reinforced glass and heavy steel. I had personally designed every single square inch of that sprawling property 15 years ago. I poured the heavy foundation concrete. I argued aggressively with the structural engineers over the exact placement of the interior load-bearing beams. I wired the complex electrical grids with my own bare hands. I gave it to Derek and Monica as a generous wedding gift, because I genuinely wanted them to have an impenetrable fortress of safety. Now it was the fortified headquarters of my own personal destruction. Garrett parked the car exactly half a mile down the road, hiding the vehicle carefully behind a thick cluster of tall, snow-covered pine trees. We walked the rest of the agonizing way in absolute silence. The freezing wind whipped violently across the flat surface of the frozen lake, biting ruthlessly through my thick layers of clothing. As we slowly approached the massive wrought-iron front gates, the property looked entirely dark and heavily fortified. High-definition security cameras were prominently mounted on every single corner of the eaves, their red digital sensors glowing faintly in the cold night. Derek always loved to openly brag about his state-of-the-art alarm system to his wealthy friends. But Derek only truly understood software. He did not understand fundamental architecture. He did not know that a physical house breathes, that it has secret veins and arteries buried deep behind the painted drywall. "Follow me quietly," I whispered to Garrett. We intentionally bypassed the main illuminated driveway and walked through the thick, frozen brush along the western property line. I led him directly to a narrow blind spot located perfectly between the rear stone patio and the external generator housing unit. It was a precise 3-foot corridor that the expensive security cameras simply could not physically see. I knelt down beside the cold, rough stone foundation. My ungloved hands were numb from the freezing outdoor temperatures, but my ingrained muscle memory guided my fingers perfectly in the pitch dark. I located a specifically loose decorative stone near the bottom baseboard and pulled it free from the surrounding mortar. Directly behind it was a manual override panel I had secretly installed during the initial construction phase. It was a physical fail-safe measure entirely disconnected from the main wireless network of the house. I punched in a complex sequence of 6 numbers. A surprisingly quiet, distinct mechanical click echoed sharply in the freezing night air. A heavy metal hatch perfectly concealed within the wooden patio decking popped open a fraction of an inch. We slipped inside quickly, pulling the heavy steel door shut securely above us. The air in the hidden basement utility bunker was stale, smelling faintly of electrical ozone, and surprisingly warm compared to the raging winter storm outside. I flicked on a small maintenance light. The narrow concrete room was filled with electrical breaker panels, thick plumbing access valves, and a large isolated server rack humming quietly in the far corner. When I built this massive house, I adamantly refused to connect the internal security mainframe to the vulnerable public internet. I kept a localized hardwired server down here that automatically recorded every camera feed and microphone input in the entire building. Derek had layered his commercial software over my infrastructure. I pulled up a metal chair and powered on the monitor. The screen flickered, bathing the room in a pale blue glow. Garrett leaned closely over my shoulder in complete silence as I navigated the operating system and bypassed the obsolete administrative firewalls. 12 camera feeds populated the monitor. I could see the empty driveway, the locked gates, the kitchen, and the master bedroom, where Monica was sleeping beneath a duvet. My eyes locked onto the feed from the living room. Derek was not sleeping. He was pacing furiously back and forth across the expensive hardwood floor, like a trapped, desperate animal. The digital timestamp glowing on the bottom corner of the monitor read exactly 3 in the morning. The glowing orange embers in the massive stone fireplace cast long, dark, nervous shadows across his sweating face. He looked absolutely undeniably terrified. His designer silk tie was undone. His expensive tailored dress shirt was heavily wrinkled, and he was tightly clutching a half-empty bottle of premium scotch in his shaking right hand. He took a heavy swig directly from the glass bottle, his chest heaving with rapid, panicked breaths. He abruptly stopped his frantic pacing and practically threw the heavy glass bottle down onto the delicate marble coffee table, spilling dark amber liquid across the polished surface. He reached deep into his trouser pocket and pulled out a cheap disposable burner phone. My only son, the polished hedge fund executive, was shaking uncontrollably as his thumb dialed a phone number into the plastic keypad. I reached out and cranked the audio dial on the server rack to its absolute maximum volume. The hidden microphone embedded deep in the living room ceiling picked up his trembling voice with crystal clear precision. I held my breath in the cold, dark bunker, my hands gripping the edge of the cold metal desk tightly, waiting to hear exactly who my son was desperately calling in the middle of the quiet night. The audio feed crackled softly through the speakers. Derek pressed the burner phone tightly against his ear, his knuckles white. I leaned closer to the monitor, my heart pounding in my chest. "It is me," Derek whispered into the receiver. His voice was trembling, stripped of all its usual arrogant confidence. "I told you I just need a few more days." The old man took the bait. "He is gone. The asset transfer is already initiated. The power of attorney is active. You will have your money by Monday. Just keep your guys away from my wife. Keep them away from my house." He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end of the line. Derek swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. "I swear to you," Derek pleaded. "The money is coming. Just call them off." He ended the call, tossed the plastic phone onto the sofa, and buried his face in his hands. He let out a ragged, pathetic sob. In the bunker, Garrett and I exchanged a long, heavy look. My son was not just greedy. He was in deep trouble with dangerous people. He was using my entire life savings as a ransom to buy his own life back. We spent the rest of the night in that freezing concrete room. Garrett and I took turns resting on the cold floor, but neither of us truly slept. Adrenaline and sheer fury kept my eyes wide open. I sat in the metal chair, staring at the grid of security feeds, watching the dark hours slowly tick by. I had built this beautiful home to be a sanctuary for my family, a place of warmth and safety. Now it felt like a hollowed-out crime scene. When morning finally broke, a pale gray winter light filtered through a small ventilation grate near the ceiling of the bunker. Upstairs, the house began to wake up. At 7 in the morning, I watched Derek stumble into the kitchen. He looked completely exhausted. He poured himself a massive cup of black coffee, completely ignoring Monica, who walked in moments later. My daughter-in-law looked absolutely pristine. She wore a tailored beige suit, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She did not look like a woman whose husband was terrified for his life. She looked like a woman preparing for a highly profitable business transaction. Derek left the house shortly after speeding away in his Porsche toward the city. An hour passed in relative silence. I watched Monica pacing the kitchen, checking her expensive watch repeatedly. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy front doorbell chimed. I quickly switched the main monitor to the front porch camera. A man was standing there. He was tall, heavily built, and completely bald. He was not wearing a standard real estate agent blazer. Instead, he wore a dark leather jacket and heavy work boots. He carried a battered leather clipboard. I knew this specific type of man very well. In the gritty early days of my commercial real estate career in Chicago, I had crossed paths with men exactly like him. He was a shadow market liquidator. These were the guys you called when you needed to dump a multi-million-dollar property fast, completely off the books, no questions asked, and strictly for untraceable cash. Monica opened the door with a bright, eager smile. She ushered the massive man inside. I switched the camera feed back to the main living area, turning up the audio dial to catch every single word. "You are right on time, Silas," Monica said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I appreciate you coming out so quickly." "Time is money, Mrs. Caldwell," the man replied. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. He stepped into the center of the grand living room, his boots tracking melting snow onto the pristine hardwood floors I had personally installed. He looked around, visually calculating the square footage and the premium finishings. "This is a prime piece of real estate. Custom stonework, lakefront access. You understand that moving a property like this on the shadow market means taking a massive haircut on the actual appraisal value." "I am fully aware," Monica said smoothly, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "We are not looking for retail value. We are looking for speed. We need liquid cash, and we need the transaction completed without a traditional banking trail." The man named Silas grunted, writing something down on his clipboard. "I can probably bundle this to an overseas buyer. Russian or maybe a shell corporation out of Cyprus. But they are going to want it completely empty. Cleaned out to the bare studs. No emotional attachments left behind." He walked toward the far end of the room, stopping directly in front of the custom mahogany display cabinets I had built to house my most precious memories. He pointed the end of his pen at the heavy antique oak dining table. Then he gestured toward the framed photographs resting on the mantel. They were beautiful, irreplaceable pictures of my late wife, Lillian. Pictures of our wedding day. Pictures of us building this very house together, smiling, covered in sawdust and paint. "What about all this junk?" Silas asked bluntly. "The overseas buyers do not want your family heirlooms. If I have to hire a crew to haul this away, it comes out of your final cash payout." I gripped the edge of the metal desk in the bunker. My fingernails dug into my palms. I waited to hear my daughter-in-law defend the sacred memories of the family she had married into. I waited for even a fraction of human decency. Monica walked over to the mantel. She picked up a framed photograph of Lillian, looked at it for exactly 1 second, and tossed it carelessly into a nearby cardboard box. "Trash all this," Monica said. Her voice was as cold and hard as the winter ice outside. "I do not care what you do with it. Burn it. Throw it in the lake. It is just old junk anyway." Silas nodded, scribbling another note on his battered clipboard. "Fine. I will have a disposal crew here by the weekend, but I cannot officially transfer the deed or wire the cash until you have full, uncontested legal clearance to sell. The title is still co-owned by your father-in-law. Correct, I cannot move a stolen house." Monica smiled. It was a terrifying, calculating smile that sent a literal chill down my spine. "Do not worry about the title," she said smoothly. "We will have the official death certificate by next week. Just have the paperwork ready. We need to liquidate this property for $3 million cash completely off the books. A death certificate." The words hung heavily in the stale air of the concrete bunker. I stared blindly at the glowing monitor, feeling my breathing stop entirely. You do not acquire a death certificate for a man who just departed on a flight. You only obtain that specific document if you are absolutely guaranteed that the man is going to die. My own flesh and blood did not just steal my fortune. He arranged my execution. My own flesh and blood did not just steal my fortune. He arranged my execution. I stood frozen in the dim light of the concrete bunker, the horror settling into my bones. For decades, I protected my son. I funded his elite education, paid for his extravagant wedding, and built the roof over his head. In return, he priced my life at $3 million and contracted a shadow liquidator to erase my existence. Garrett placed a firm hand on my shoulder, grounding me. He recognized the look in my eyes. It was the look of a man who had crossed a permanent threshold. "We cannot stay down here much longer." Garrett whispered, his voice a low rumble. "The liquidator will be walking the perimeter soon to check the foundation. We need actionable leverage right now." I forced my lungs to draw a deep breath. I nodded, stepping aside to give the investigator access to the keyboard. "You said you tracked digital footprints for the financial crimes unit," I told him. "Derek is running his life through the localized wireless network of this house. The main router is located directly above our heads in the primary study. If you can bridge the hardwired connection from this isolated server into the wireless broadcast, you can intercept his active data." Garrett sat in the metal chair and cracked his knuckles. "Watch the external cameras," he commanded, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Let me know the absolute second that bald liquidator heads toward the backyard." I kept my eyes locked on the secondary monitor, watching Silas measuring the exterior windows while Monica trailed behind him. On the main screen, lines of complex code began cascading rapidly. Garrett was executing a localized packet sniffing protocol. He was utilizing the backdoor access I built into the physical architecture to bypass the external encryption. Derek was an incredibly arrogant and foolish man. He believed his hedge fund software was impenetrable, but he foolishly installed it on top of a foundational network he did not truly understand. He built his digital fortress on my literal concrete floor. "We are in," Garrett announced softly. His eyes were narrowed in intense concentration. "He is currently connected to the network upstairs. His personal laptop is actively syncing with his cloud storage. I am initiating a forced data clone. I am mirroring his entire hard drive directly onto the encrypted partition of your server." I watched the progress bar inch forward. 10%. 20%. Every passing second felt like an eternity. Upstairs, the heavy footsteps of the liquidator echoed faintly through the floorboards. He was walking toward the basement stairs. My heart hammered against my ribs. If Silas decided to inspect the utility systems, he would find the hidden access panel. 50%. 60%. The progress bar crawled. I held my breath, listening to the heavy thud of boots directly above us. Silas paused right over the bunker. I could hear his muffled voice asking Monica about the electrical grid. She confidently told him the main breaker was in the garage. The heavy footsteps slowly moved away. 90%. 100%. Transfer complete. Garrett confirmed, severing the wireless bridge. "We have his entire digital life perfectly preserved." Garrett began opening the cloned directories. He bypassed the standard financial reports and targeted the hidden partitions Derek buried behind generic naming conventions. We opened a master spreadsheet labeled as routine tax depreciation. As the dense columns of numbers and fragmented transaction logs filled the screen, the true scale of my son's operation became clear. It was not a simple case of mismanagement. It was not a bad quarter in the stock market. Derek engineered a massive, sophisticated Ponzi scheme. He falsified quarterly returns for his wealthy clients, paying off early investors with capital aggressively raised from new victims. But the financial bleeding had become unsustainable. He dug a massive hole, and in his desperation to fill it, he turned to the absolute worst kind of capital. Garrett clicked on a secondary ledger. "Look at these specific routing numbers, Victor," he said, tracing his finger across the monitor. "These are not standard corporate investments. These deposits originated from a complex web of shell companies tied directly to the Eastern European underworld. They operate a brutal syndicate right here in Chicago. The money trail was explicitly clear. Derek had not just lost money. He actively solicited $12 million in illicit cash from a ruthless crime syndicate led by a man named Ivan. Derek promised them a massive return on their dirty money, intending to use their capital to artificially prop up his failing hedge fund. But the market violently turned against him. The investments tanked. The $12 million was completely gone, vaporized in a series of disastrously leveraged trades. My son stole from men who did not use lawyers to settle debts. They used violence. He had arrogant delusions of being a Wall Street titan, but he was nothing more than a desperate gambler borrowing money from the devil. Garrett opened an encrypted email client hidden deep within the cloned files. He isolated a single message received late last night. It was a terrifyingly direct communication. There were no corporate pleasantries. The subject line was blank. I leaned closer to the bright screen, reading the chilling words sent directly from Ivan. The message was brutally simple. Your excuses are exhausted. The market is not our concern. You have exactly 7 days to replace the $12 million you stole. If the funds are not fully transferred by midnight next Thursday, we will not send lawyers. We will send a team to butcher you and your beautiful wife in your custom home. We will find your extended family. We will burn your entire world to ashes. The timer is running. Garrett slowly pushed his chair back from the desk, letting out a heavy breath. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with grim realization. That is why he stole your estate, Victor Garrett said quietly. He is not trying to get rich. He is trying to survive. He needs your $18 million to pay back Ivan and buy his own life. The truth slammed into me with the force of a freight train. Derek was a dead man walking. He triggered my power of attorney and hired a liquidator to sell my house because he was out of time. He was planning to sacrifice my life, my freedom, and my legacy to cover his catastrophic debts. He was perfectly willing to let me disappear forever just to save his own skin. He brought the most dangerous predators in the city directly to my doorstep. We had exactly 1 week before a violent crime syndicate descended upon my family. The clock was ticking, and I was the only obstacle standing between my son and his salvation. But he made a fatal miscalculation. He underestimated the man who built him. I reached forward and disconnected the cloned drive. We are leaving, I told Garrett, my voice cold and absolute. Derek thinks he has 7 days to steal my life. We are going to ensure he does not even have 3. Garrett did not waste a single second. He immediately pulled his chair back up to the metal desk, the wheels scraping harshly against the concrete floor of the bunker. He leaned over the glowing monitor, his face bathed in the pale blue light, and began typing with a renewed, aggressive focus. The sheer urgency of our situation hung heavy in the stale basement air. If Derek had a 1-week deadline to pay back a ruthless crime syndicate, his hostile takeover of my estate was entirely rooted in desperate panic. But desperate men make careless mistakes, and I needed to find the exact mistake that would allow me to dismantle his entire operation. I stood behind Garrett, my eyes scanning the rapid cascade of data scrolling across the screen. I told him to dig deeper into the weeks leading up to my scheduled flight. I needed to understand the exact mechanics of how Derek planned to completely erase me from the map. He had purchased a first-class ticket to Cambodia, but a simple plane ticket was not enough to guarantee a man would vanish forever. Garrett navigated away from the primary hedge fund ledgers and accessed a heavily encrypted subfolder hidden within his personal financial directories. The folder was heavily protected, but Garrett used a brute force decryption tool he had loaded onto his flash drive. Lines of code ran down the screen for several agonizing minutes before the digital lock finally broke. A new spreadsheet opened completely devoid of standard corporate formatting. It was a raw, unedited transaction log detailing a series of massive cryptocurrency transfers. I leaned closer, tracking the dates on the left side of the screen. Exactly 14 days ago, Derek had authorized a massive conversion of liquid cash into Bitcoin. The total amount was staggering. It was not enough to pay off his $12 million debt to the Chicago syndicate, but it was a remarkably specific sum of money. He had moved exactly $250,000 into a decentralized digital wallet. I pointed at the screen, tracing the destination address of the Bitcoin transfer. "Where did this money go?" I asked, my voice tight with anticipation. Garrett highlighted the transaction block. His brow furrowed in deep concentration. He opened a secondary terminal window and began running a tracing protocol on the digital address. "He is bouncing the signal through multiple proxy servers," Garrett explained, his eyes darting across the scrolling data. "It is a classic anonymizing technique designed to obscure the final destination. But whoever set this up was sloppy with their internal categorization. Look right here." Garrett pointed to a small, seemingly innocuous line of text embedded in the transaction metadata. Derek had labeled the massive transfer under the heading of International Travel Services. It was a sickeningly mundane description for $250,000 in untraceable digital currency. "This is not a direct payment to a travel agency," Garrett continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "This specific routing protocol is exclusively used for dark web escrow accounts. He is not just buying a service. He is depositing funds into a holding account managed by a neutral third party. The money sits in digital purgatory until a specific condition is met or a specific task is officially confirmed as completed. Once the proof is provided, the escrow releases the funds to the final recipient." My stomach violently churned as the horrifying reality of the situation began to fully materialize in my mind. Derek had not simply abandoned me at an international terminal. He had meticulously orchestrated a completely untraceable transaction directly linked to my final destination. He was paying for a service that required undeniable proof of completion. The cold, damp air of the concrete bunker felt suddenly suffocating. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, forcing myself to suppress the overwhelming wave of grief and pure rage building in my chest. The boy I had raised, the son I had taught to ride a bicycle on the driveway directly above our heads, had sat in his luxurious home office and methodically transferred a fortune in digital currency to ensure his father never returned from Southeast Asia. He had priced my life at $250,000. He had utilized the very wealth I had generated to fund my own execution. It was a level of cold, calculating cruelty that defied all human comprehension. I opened my eyes, staring at the glowing monitor, with a renewed, icy resolve. I did not want to simply stop his plan anymore. I wanted to utterly destroy the foundation of his entire existence. "We need to know exactly who is sitting on the other end of that escrow account," I commanded, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. "I need a name, an organization, or a location. Find out exactly what he purchased under the guise of International Travel Services." Garrett nodded grimly. He pulled a secondary, heavily encrypted smartphone from his jacket pocket. "This goes far beyond standard financial forensics. Caldwell," he said, unlocking the device. "I need to reach out to my old network. When I worked undercover for the Chicago Police Department, I cultivated a highly reliable informant who specializes in dark web financial tracking. If anyone can break the final layer of encryption on this escrow wallet, it is him. But it is going to cost us." I did not hesitate. "Pay him whatever he wants," I replied instantly. "Wire him $10,000 right now as a good faith deposit. I need the identity of the recipient before the sun fully rises over that lake outside." Garrett rapidly typed a highly coded message into the burner phone, authorized a secure digital payment from his own operational funds, and set the phone down on the metal desk. The tension in the small utility bunker was practically suffocating. We waited in absolute unbroken silence. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the isolated server rack and the faint, distant howling of the winter wind rattling the heavy steel hatch above us. 30 excruciating minutes passed. I paced the narrow length of the room, my mind replaying every interaction I had with Derek over the past 6 months, searching for the exact moment the ambitious hedge fund manager transformed into a ruthless, calculating monster. He had smiled at me over dinner. He had poured me coffee. He had hugged me at the airport terminal, all while he knew a digital timer was counting down to my violent demise. Suddenly, the burner phone vibrated loudly against the solid metal desk, shattering the heavy silence. Garrett snatched it up instantly, his dark eyes quickly scanning the incoming encrypted text message. He slowly lowered the small device, exhaling a sharp breath, and looked directly at me with a deeply unsettling intensity. He cracked the escrow shield entirely, Victor Garrett whispered. The anonymous Bitcoin wallet is formally registered to a highly organized, utterly ruthless mercenary ring. Their primary operational base is located exactly 30 miles outside of Siem Reap, Cambodia. Derek deliberately contracted a localized hit squad to meet you at the main international airport arrivals gate. The words hung in the freezing air of the concrete bunker. They were heavy and completely toxic. I stared at Garrett, my mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. A hit squad. My son did not just want me stranded and penniless in a foreign country. He wanted me dead. He needed me dead. The realization was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. It made it incredibly difficult to draw a full breath. But a lifetime of surviving brutal corporate warfare had taught me one fundamental rule. You never act on assumption. You demand proof. The blockchain transaction was merely circumstantial evidence. It proved Derek sent money to a dark web escrow account. A clever defense attorney could argue that Derek was being blackmailed, or that he was purchasing illicit goods, not a murder contract. I needed the smoking gun. I needed the undeniable connection between my son and the mercenaries waiting for me in Cambodia. I turned my attention back to the glowing monitor. Garrett had cloned the entirety of the massive digital footprint. That included his localized network traffic, his laptop hard drive, and the automated cloud backups from his personal mobile devices. Derek was incredibly arrogant. Arrogant men always leave a trail because they believe they are far too smart to be caught. Open the cloud synchronization logs, I instructed Garrett. My voice sounded completely hollow, belonging to a stranger. If Derek coordinated a sophisticated international assassination, he did not do it strictly through text messages on a burner phone. He had to negotiate the terms. He had to establish the parameters of the contract. Look for voice memos. Look for deleted audio files. Check the temporary cache. Garrett cracked his knuckles and leaned heavily over the plastic keyboard in the dark. The harsh blue light of the screen illuminated the deep lines on his face. He understood the absolute gravity of the search. He was no longer just a hired investigator tracing stolen funds. He was a witness to a patricide that was currently in motion. His fingers flew across the keys. He initiated a deep sector scan of the cloned hard drive. We were digging through the digital graveyard of his entire life. He was extremely meticulous with his primary communications. Garrett murmured, his dark eyes scanning the rapid cascade of data. He utilized encrypted messaging applications with disappearing texts. He wiped his primary call logs every single night. But he made a critical error in his device architecture. He linked his burner phone to the secure home network for a firmware update. When he did that, the router automatically backed up the localized device cache to his hidden cloud partition. Garrett isolated a specific subfolder. It was labeled with a string of random alphanumeric characters. He ran a decryption algorithm. The progress bar crawled across the screen. Every passing second felt like a physical blow. The damp air of the bunker chilled my skin, but I was sweating profusely. The decryption finished with a quiet chime. A list of recovered files populated the monitor. They were audio files. They were automatically recorded voice notes and intercepted call logs that Derek had hastily deleted. He thought they were gone forever. He did not know his own smart home had betrayed him. Garrett highlighted the most recent audio file. The timestamp indicated it was recorded exactly 3 days ago, It was the exact same day Derek had poured me a cup of tea and tricked me into signing the legal documents. Play it. I ordered the investigator very quietly now. My jaw was clenched so tightly, my teeth ached. Garrett pressed the button. A soft hiss of digital static filled the small concrete room. Then a voice echoed from the small speakers. It was Derek. His tone was not panicked like the phone call we had intercepted earlier. His tone was cold, calculated, and completely devoid of human emotion. It was the exact voice he used when negotiating hostile corporate takeovers. "The target is boarding the flight on schedule," Derek said. The audio quality was slightly muffled, but the words were perfectly clear. "He is actively traveling alone right now. He believes he is going on a spiritual retreat. You will meet him at the arrivals gate in Siem Reap, holding a sign with his name. From that moment, he belongs to you." A heavily accented, deeply distorted voice replied. The distortion was clearly added to mask the identity of the mercenary. "The parameters of the extraction are understood. How do you want the final resolution handled? We can make him disappear completely. No body, no trace, just another missing tourist." I stood entirely frozen. I was listening to the logistics of my own murder echoing across the dark room. "No," Derek replied sharply. "The old man has a history of high blood pressure, a tragic fall near the temple ruins, or a heart attack in the jungle. I don't care. Just make it look natural. I need his death confirmed in 72 hours so the life insurance and trust fund transfer clears before Ivan's deadline. If that money does not hit my accounts by Thursday, we both lose everything. Do not fail me." The audio recording clicked and went entirely dead. The complete silence returned heavier and darker than ever before. The pale blue light faded away right then. I stared blankly at the screen. The words repeated on an endless, agonizing loop in my mind. A tragic fall near the temple ruins. A heart attack in the jungle. I do not care. Just make it look natural. My son, my own child, the boy I had protected and nurtured for his entire life. He had coldly orchestrated my execution to cover his debts to a violent crime syndicate. He had deliberately sold my life for $250,000. The adrenaline that had sustained me for the past 24 hours abruptly and completely evaporated forever. It vanished, leaving behind a hollow, agonizing void. The concrete walls of the bunker seemed to suddenly close in around me. The air grew incredibly thin. I tried to draw a breath, but my lungs refused to expand. A sharp, burning pain flared deep inside my chest right then. It radiated outward, numbing my arms and blurring my vision. I reached out blindly, trying to grab the edge of the heavy metal desk for support. My fingers slipped across the smooth surface. My legs simply stopped working. The strength drained from my muscles in a sudden, terrifying downward physical rush. I collapsed backward. The cold, unforgiving concrete floor rushed up to meet me. The physical impact jarred my bones, but I barely felt it. Victor Garrett shouted loudly, dropping down directly beside me. He grabbed my shoulders, shaking me roughly. "Victor, stay with me. Breathe. Look at me." I could not speak. I could not move. I lay on the freezing floor of the hidden bunker, staring up at the dark ceiling. The world was spinning. My son did not just blindly steal from me. He actually paid for my execution. The darkness finally consumed my vision completely right then. The darkness finally consumed my vision completely right then. But the physical collapse was only temporary. I opened my eyes to the harsh glare of the maintenance light swinging gently above me. Garrett was still kneeling by my side. His hands were gripping my shoulders firmly. He was speaking my name over and over again. I blinked away the lingering dizziness and forced myself to sit up against the cold concrete wall. My chest still ached with a dull and heavy throb, but the blinding panic had completely evaporated. I raised a hand to signal I was fine. I did not need medical attention. I did not need sympathy. I simply needed a moment of absolute silence to process the profound death that had just occurred inside this basement. It was not my physical death. The hitmen waiting in Cambodia would never get the chance to fulfill their contract. The death that happened on this concrete floor was something far more profound. It was the absolute and permanent death of a father. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my winter coat and pulled out my worn leather wallet. My fingers were no longer trembling. They were perfectly steady. I opened the fold and slipped out a small, faded photograph I had carried with me for over 3 decades. It was a picture of Derek at 7 years old. We were standing together on the wooden docks of Lake Michigan. He was holding a fishing pole and smiling up at me with eyes full of absolute trust and innocent adoration. I stared at that young boy in the photograph. I remembered the endless nights I stayed awake worrying about his fever. I remembered the countless hours I spent teaching him how to tie a proper Windsor knot. I remembered the sheer pride that swelled in my chest when I handed him the keys to his first car. I had poured my entire soul into building a legacy so that young boy would never have to experience the brutal hardships I endured. I looked at the photograph, waiting for the familiar warmth of paternal love to wash over me. I waited for the instinct to protect my child, to rise up and demand that I find a way to save him from his terrible mistakes. But as I stared at the smiling boy in the picture, I felt absolutely nothing. The well of unconditional love had run completely dry. The man pacing nervously on the living room floor upstairs was not the innocent boy in the photograph. That man was a parasitic entity who had worn my last name as a convenient disguise. He was a cowardly thief who had sold my life to a violent crime syndicate to cover his own pathetic failures. He had calculated the precise monetary value of my existence and deemed it an acceptable loss for his personal survival. He was willing to let me die alone in a foreign jungle just so he could keep sleeping in his custom-built bedroom. I did not shed a single tear. Crying is a biological response to unexpected loss, and I had simply lost an illusion. The painful reality was far too stark for sorrow. I slowly turned the photograph over in my hand, hiding the smiling face of the boy from my sight. I placed the picture face down on the cold metal desk and pressed my palm flat against it. A profound and chilling clarity settled over my mind. The grieving father who wanted to understand his son was dead and buried. In his place stood the ruthless corporate executive who had spent 40 years dismantling massive conglomerates and crushing aggressive rivals. I was Victor Caldwell. I built skyscrapers from dirt. I navigated cutthroat boardrooms populated by men far smarter and far more dangerous than the pathetic coward trembling in the house above me. Derek had treated me like a naive, disposable asset. He was about to learn why men in my industry truly feared my name. I looked up at Garrett. The private investigator was watching me with a silent, calculating gaze. He recognized the fundamental shift in my posture. He saw the cold, dead focus returning to my eyes. "Garrett," I said quietly, my voice echoing off the concrete walls with absolute authority. "If a stray dog wanders onto your property and bites your hand, you might feel a brief moment of pity for the hungry animal. You might try to understand why it attacked you. But if that same dog contracts rabies and actively tries to rip out your throat, you do not waste your time trying to reason with it. You do not offer it food or try to rehabilitate it. You recognize it for the fatal threat it is, and you put it down permanently. My son is a rabid dog. He has infected his own life with a terminal disease, and he is trying to drag me down into the grave with him. I will not allow that to happen. I am going to end this." Garrett stood up slowly, crossing his arms over his chest. He did not judge me. He simply nodded in complete agreement. "What is your strategy?" he asked bluntly. "We have an international hit squad waiting for you in Cambodia. We have a primary bank account freezing your liquid assets in less than 72 hours. We have a black market liquidator measuring your house for a cash sale. And we have a violent Eastern European crime boss demanding $12 million by next Thursday. Derek has completely surrounded himself with lethal threats. If we just expose him to the authorities right now, Ivan and his syndicate will butcher him before the police can even file the official paperwork. If we try to quietly transfer your funds back, Derek will panic and execute his secondary contingency plans. He has weaponized his own desperate situation against you. I stood up from the floor, brushing the dust from my heavy winter coat. I turned my attention to the glowing monitor, looking directly at the paused video feed of Derek, sitting on his expensive sofa. He has indeed surrounded himself with lethal threats, I replied, a dark, humorless smile pulling at the corners of my mouth. But he mistakenly believes he is the one holding the leash. He thinks he can skillfully juggle the syndicate, the mercenaries, and the bank transfers to walk away completely clean. He thinks he is playing a complex game of chess. But he is actually standing blindfolded in a room filled with explosives. We are not going to call the police. We are not going to stop his bank transfers immediately. We are not going to run away and hide. We are going to take all the dangerous elements he brought into my life and use them to build a cage. I will control the timeline, I stated, staring at the screen. We will intercept his dark web communications and forge the confirmation of my death. We will let Derek present my stolen money to Ivan. Then I will freeze the accounts. They will tear his entire life apart from the inside. The cold, unforgiving concrete floor rushed up to meet me. The physical impact jarred my bones, but I barely felt it. Victor Garrett shouted loudly, dropping down directly beside me. He grabbed my shoulders, shaking me roughly. Victor, stay with me. Breathe. Look at me. I could not speak. I could not move. I lay on the freezing floor of the hidden bunker, staring up at the dark ceiling. The world was spinning. My son did not just blindly steal from me. He actually paid for my execution. The darkness finally consumed my vision completely right then. We slipped out of the concrete bunker the exact same way we entered. The freezing wind whipping off the lake hit my face, but I did not feel the cold. I felt absolutely nothing but a terrifying singular focus. We navigated the blind spots of the security cameras, leaving the shadow liquidator and my daughter-in-law to their morbid inventory. We walked the half-mile back to Garrett's hidden sedan in complete silence. My mind was no longer clouded by the grief of losing a son. That emotional weakness had died in the basement. Now I was purely a man protecting his empire. Garrett started the engine, the heater roaring to life. Where to? He asked, his eyes locked on the dark road ahead. Downtown, I instructed, my voice flat and completely devoid of hesitation. Take the express lanes. I need to see my attorney before the morning traffic begins. We are going to sever the financial arteries of Derek's operation. The drive into the heart of Chicago was a blur of gray concrete and yellow streetlights. The city was just beginning to wake up, ignorant to the quiet war being waged in its shadows. Garrett parked the sedan in a subterranean garage beneath a towering glass skyscraper. This was the fortress of Preston Cole. I had called him on the burner phone during the drive, instructing him to meet me at his private offices before his staff arrived. We rode the private elevator up to the 50th floor. The doors slid open to reveal Preston standing in the center of his expansive mahogany-paneled office. He was wearing a tailored suit, a stark contrast to my wrinkled winter coat. When he saw me step out of the elevator, physically alive and standing firmly on my own 2 feet, the ruthless attorney let out a long, shuddering breath. Victor, Preston said, walking forward to grasp my hand firmly. I have defended corporate raiders and cartel bosses, but seeing the fraudulent death warrant your son drafted made my blood run entirely cold. I am profoundly glad you are standing here. There is no time for pleasantries, Preston, I replied, releasing his grip and walking directly to his massive desk. Derek did not just forge a power of attorney. He stole $12 million from an Eastern European crime syndicate run by a man named Ivan. He hired mercenaries in Cambodia to ensure I never returned, and he is currently liquidating my $4 million lake house on the shadow market. He intends to use my $18 million liquid portfolio to pay off his mob debts before his deadline expires next Thursday. Preston stopped dead in his tracks. The color drained completely from his sharp face. He stared at me, processing the sheer catastrophic magnitude of the criminal liability. He essentially strapped a bomb to your entire legacy, Preston stated softly. Exactly, I said, taking a seat in the leather chair opposite his desk. And we are going to detonate it while he is still holding it. I need a legal counterstrike. I need to aggressively sever his access to every single cent of my money right now. Preston walked behind his desk, his professional instincts instantly taking over. He opened his secure laptop and began typing furiously. Because you are physically present, demonstrably alive, and of completely sound mind, his fraudulent, durable power of attorney is inherently vulnerable. However, simply canceling it is not enough. If we just freeze the accounts, Derek can tie us up in an ugly legal battle, claiming you are mentally unfit. We need a nuclear option. We need to move the assets into a fortress he cannot possibly penetrate. What is the mechanism? I asked, watching the lines of legal text populate his monitor. An irrevocable trust. Preston answered, his eyes locked on the screen. We are going to establish a locked charity trust immediately. We will transfer the entirety of your $18 million fortune, along with the official deed, to the lake house and all your holding companies directly into this new entity. You will be named as the sole exclusive lifetime beneficiary. The trust will be managed by a fiercely independent board of directors, rendering the capital completely untouchable by anyone else. Explain the exact limitations, I demanded, needing to understand the trap I was building. Once you sign these documents, the money is gone from the standard banking system, Preston explained, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Derek cannot touch it. A judge cannot touch it. The Russian mob cannot touch it. Even you cannot unilaterally withdraw the principal sum without board approval. It forms an absolute impenetrable legal shield. When Derek attempts to execute his wire transfer to the Cayman Islands on Friday, the bank will reject it. The funds will simply no longer exist in the accounts he controls. And what happens to his power of attorney, Garrett? Asked from his position near the office door. It becomes a worthless piece of scrap paper, Preston replied with a sharp, predatory smile. You cannot govern assets that have been legally relocated outside of the personal estate. Derek will be the proud administrator of an entirely empty vault. Print the documents, I commanded. Preston hit a button on his keyboard. The heavy laser printer in the corner of the office hummed to life, spitting out dozens of pages of dense legal text. He gathered the massive stack of paper, squared the edges on his desk, and placed a heavy fountain pen directly in front of me. Victor, Preston said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming incredibly serious. You need to understand the absolute finality of this action. Once you sign your name on these lines, your legacy is permanently locked away. You are effectively burning the bridge back to your old life. My old life was an illusion, I said coldly. My son destroyed it the moment he put a price on my head. I picked up the heavy fountain pen. My hand did not shake. I did not feel a single ounce of hesitation. I signed my name on the first page. I flipped to the next page and signed again. I systematically worked my way through the massive stack of legal documents, legally dismantling the empire I had spent 40 years building and weaponizing it into an inescapable trap. When I finished the final signature, Preston immediately gathered the documents. He applied his official notary seal to the pages, stamping each one with a loud, resounding thud. He scanned the signed copies back into his secure terminal and initiated the digital filing process directly with the federal banking authorities. It is done, Preston announced, leaning back in his chair. The automated system is processing the transfer. Within the next hour, your entire $18 million fortune will be legally migrated into the irrevocable trust. The accounts Derek is relying on are now functionally empty. I stood up from the leather chair, buttoning my heavy winter coat. A profound sense of cold satisfaction settled deep into my bones. The trap was officially set, Victor, Preston said quietly, stopping me before I could turn toward the door. You have successfully protected your assets. Derek's power of attorney is now completely worthless paper. He cannot liquidate your house. He cannot steal your portfolio. But you realize what you have just done, right? I looked back at my attorney, my expression entirely blank. You found the ultimatum email. Preston continued, his voice tight with genuine concern. You know the Eastern European Syndicate gave him exactly 7 days to replace the $12 million he stole. He was relying entirely on your money to save his own life. When the mob finds out the money is gone and the accounts are empty, they will not negotiate. They will kill him. I stared at Preston for a long, heavy moment. The image of the little boy holding the fishing pole flashed briefly in my mind, but it was quickly replaced by the audio recording of the man ordering a heart attack in the jungle. That is Derek's problem, I replied. Preston stared at me for a long time after I spoke. He saw the conviction in my eyes and gave a respectful nod. He understood that my son had crossed a line, completely erasing all paternal obligations. I thanked Preston, shook his hand, and walked out of the skyscraper into the morning light. Garrett was waiting outside in the idling sedan. We had secured the assets neutralizing Derek's ability to steal my wealth. Now it was time to spring the trap. We needed to introduce the wolves into his sanctuary. During the drive toward the lake house, I instructed Garrett to stop at an electronics store in the suburbs. I walked down the lit aisles and purchased a cheap, untraceable prepaid mobile device using cash. We then drove to a crowded coffee shop 2 miles from my estate. We needed to operate on a public wireless network to mask our digital footprint. I sat in a booth by the window, the burner phone resting on the table. Garrett opened his encrypted laptop and accessed the dark web directories he had cataloged earlier. I need a direct line of communication to Ivan, I stated flatly. The Eastern European Syndicate must have a secure point of contact for their high-value debtors. Garrett methodically parsed through the fragmented data we cloned from Derek's hidden server partitions. He isolated a specific encrypted messaging application Derek utilized to negotiate his fraudulent extensions with the mob. Garrett extracted the primary routing address for the Syndicate's local enforcer. I picked up the burner phone and inputted the complex string of characters. I needed to sound like an opportunistic informant. I typed the message with slow, deliberate keystrokes. Derek Caldwell is liquidating his assets to flee the country. He has physical cash hidden at his lake house. Friday night. Go collect your debt. I reviewed the terrifyingly simple text. It contained the exact right amount of factual information mixed with a plausible lie. Derek was indeed liquidating my property, and Ivan already knew he was a desperate flight risk. The mention of hidden cash would be an irresistible lure for a syndicate looking to recoup a $12 million theft. I pressed the send button. The digital message vanished into the encrypted ether, flying across the city directly into the hands of ruthless killers. I snapped the burner phone in half and tossed it away. We returned to the estate shortly after noon, slipping back into the subterranean concrete bunker without alerting my treacherous daughter-in-law. The house above us was quiet, but the digital network was buzzing with frantic activity. Derek had returned from the city and connected his personal devices to the primary router. I sat at the metal desk and turned to the secondary monitor. We needed to ensure Derek remained blind to the reality of his situation. He was expecting a confirmation call from his hired mercenaries in Cambodia, verifying his father suffered a fatal accident. If he learned I never boarded the flight, he would panic and flee before the syndicate arrived. Garrett. I need you to isolate his mobile phone on the network I commanded. We must sever his communication with Southeast Asia. He cannot receive updates from the hit squad. Garrett cracked his knuckles and launched a sophisticated intercept protocol. He accessed the foundational architecture of the wireless network and built a digital firewall directly around Derek's specific device. He configured the firewall to silently block all incoming and outgoing international calls. It was an invisible quarantine. If the Cambodian mercenaries attempted to call Derek, the connection would instantly drop into a dead digital void. Furthermore, Garrett programmed the intercept to generate a fake delivery receipt for Derek's outbound messages. Whenever Derek texted his assassins for an update, his screen would show the message as successfully delivered, leaving him with the false impression they were maintaining operational silence. We spent the next 48 hours sitting in the freezing dark of the basement, methodically monitoring his digital panic. Derek paced the floors upstairs. He checked his bank portals obsessively, completely unaware his access was tied to hollowed-out accounts, superseded by the irrevocable trust. He sent increasingly aggressive messages to the Cambodian tour guide, demanding visual proof of my demise. The firewall swallowed every single word. As the hours ticked by, his anxiety morphed into a twisted confidence. He interpreted the silence as a sign of professional execution. By Friday afternoon, he genuinely believed his horrific plan had succeeded. He believed his father was dead, and his $12 million salvation was waiting for algorithms to clear. The winter sun finally set on Friday evening, casting long, dark shadows across the frozen surface of the lake. The temperature plummeted, but the atmosphere inside the bunker was electric with anticipation. The stage was perfectly set. The trap was fully armed. I switched the primary monitor to the hidden cameras installed in the grand living room above us. The digital feed flared to life, illuminating the scene in stark definition. Derek and Monica were standing by the custom mahogany mantel. They were not packing their bags or preparing to face a grieving family. They were celebrating. Derek wore a crisp white dress shirt holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne. Monica leaned against him wearing a dark silk dress, her face glowing with a triumphant, predatory smile. They looked like a couple who had just won the lottery, completely oblivious to the fact that they were standing in a house they no longer owned, waiting for money they no longer possessed. I turned the audio feed up, the sound of crystal clinking echoing softly through the basement speakers. "To the future," Derek said smoothly, raising his glass toward the roaring fireplace. It was a little messy at the end, but the old man finally served a useful purpose. "The trust fund clears on Monday morning. We wire the capital to Ivan and we book a first-class flight to Paris by Wednesday. We are entirely free, Monica." She laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound that made my skin crawl. "I told you we just needed to be decisive," she murmured, taking a sip of her champagne. "Your father was a relic. He built this fortune, but he did not have the stomach to truly use it. We are simply putting his unused capital to its proper modern use." I sat motionless in the metal chair, staring at the glowing screen. My face was a mask of cold, unyielding stone. The sheer audacity of their celebration was breathtaking, but it only solidified my resolve. They believed they had outsmarted everyone. They believed they were the apex predators of their own narrative. But they were nothing more than ignorant prey drinking expensive wine in a glass house while the wolves gathered silently in the dark woods just beyond their manicured lawn. The clock was ticking toward midnight. The syndicate was coming to collect their massive debt, and my son had absolutely nothing left to give them but his own blood. I leaned forward in the shadows of the bunker, my eyes locked on the monitor, patiently waiting for the heavy, inevitable knock on the front door. I leaned forward in the shadows of the bunker, my eyes locked on the monitor, patiently waiting for the heavy, inevitable knock on the front door. The wait was agonizingly brief. The digital clock on the secondary monitor shifted precisely to midnight, the exact boundary of the deadline Derek had arrogantly ignored. The heavy oak front doors of the estate did not receive a polite knock. They were violently breached. A thunderous, splintering crash echoed loudly through the basement speakers as the reinforced steel hinges were blown off their frames by a synchronized kinetic entry. The solid wood panels slammed inward with explosive, unstoppable force, shattering the custom entryway console table and sending a massive shower of expensive glass and splintered wood flying across the imported hardwood floor. Monica let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream that tore through the sensitive audio feed. It was a sound of absolute primal terror, the sound of a woman realizing her carefully curated reality had just been violently shattered into a million pieces. Derek physically jumped backward, his entire body convulsing in sheer panic. His face instantly drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. The delicate crystal champagne flute slipped from his trembling fingers, plummeting toward the ground and shattering into dozens of sharp, glittering fragments near his expensive leather shoes. The golden liquid pooled on the floor, seeping into the expensive wood, mixing with the debris of their shattered illusion and the dust of the broken doorway. The celebration was officially over. Through the high-definition infrared cameras, I watched as 5 massive, heavily armed figures stormed into the grand living room. They moved with terrifying, practiced military efficiency. They were not common street thugs looking to break a few fingers. They wore dark tactical gear, heavy Kevlar vests, their faces completely obscured by heavy black winter balaclavas, and they carried suppressed automatic weapons held tightly against their chests. They did not shout a single word. They did not make any unnecessary noise. They instantly secured the perimeter of the room, executing a flawless tactical sweep, blocking every possible exit, covering the large bay windows, and completely cutting off any avenue of escape. One of the massive men lunged forward and grabbed Monica roughly by the arm, violently throwing her onto the white designer sofa. She landed hard, curling immediately into a tight defensive ball. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her manicured hands desperately covering her face, her expensive silk dress twisting around her shaking legs. Derek stood frozen in the exact center of the room, his arrogant posture completely collapsing. He raised his hands in a pathetic, trembling gesture of total surrender, his chest heaving with rapid, panicked breaths. He looked exactly like a cornered animal, finally realizing the true nature of the apex predators he had foolishly invited into his beautiful home. The armed men parted silently, stepping back to clear a wide path for their leader. Ivan stepped through the ruined, splintered entryway. He did not wear tactical gear. He wore a meticulously tailored, heavy charcoal overcoat that draped elegantly over his broad, imposing shoulders. He moved with a slow, terrifying, deliberate calmness, stepping over the shattered glass and broken wood as if he were taking a leisurely, uninterrupted stroll through a quiet public park. He possessed the cold, dead, unblinking eyes of a man who had long ago forgotten how to value human life. He walked deliberately across the expansive room and stopped directly in front of Derek. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and entirely suffocating. It was broken only by Monica's desperate, muffled weeping from the sofa and the low crackle of the fireplace. Ivan slowly reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal overcoat and retrieved a heavy, matte black handgun. He did not point it immediately. He simply held it loosely by his side, letting the sheer, undeniable weight of its physical presence completely suffocate my son. "You have an incredibly beautiful home," Derek Ivan said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone with a thick, unforgiving Eastern European accent. The audio feed picked up the terrifying, smooth modulation of his tone. "It is a profound shame that you decided to fund this luxurious lifestyle with my money. I believe we had a very clear, very specific understanding regarding the strict timeline of your repayment. Thursday has passed. It is now late Friday night. The grace period is permanently over. I am here to collect my $12 million. Derek was visibly and violently shaking. Thick beads of sweat formed on his pale forehead, catching the flickering orange light from the roaring fireplace. "Ivan, please." Derek stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine that stripped him of all his remaining dignity. "I sent a secure message to your courier yesterday. I told him I needed just a few more days to finalize the transfers. The market turned aggressively against me, but I solved the problem. I swear to you, on my absolute life, I solved the entire problem. I just need the international banks to open on Monday morning." Ivan did not blink. His expression remained entirely carved from cold stone. He slowly raised the heavy handgun, lifting it with deliberate, agonizing precision, and pressed the cold steel barrel directly against the center of Derek's sweating forehead. Derek squeezed his eyes tightly shut, his knees buckling slightly under the sheer paralyzing terror of the moment. He let out a pathetic, whimpering gasp, his hands shaking wildly in the empty air beside his head. "I do not care about your market problems," Ivan whispered, leaning closer so his face was mere inches from my son. "I do not care about your banking schedules or your pathetic, cowardly excuses. You stole directly from my family. You blatantly lied to my trusted associates. You treated my operational capital like a personal gambling fund. I am not here to negotiate a financial extension. I am here to execute a penalty and take what is rightfully mine. If the $12 million is not physically hidden inside this house, then I will take my payment in flesh and blood. Starting with you and ending with the beautiful woman crying on the sofa. Please, Derek screamed, a raw, desperate, agonizing sound ripping from his throat. The tears freely flowed down his face, now completely washing away every trace of the confident executive he always pretended to be. You cannot do this. You have to listen to me for 1 minute. The money is completely secured. My father is dead. He died in Cambodia this morning. I have the official legal power of attorney. I have full, uncontested control of his entire estate. I have $18 million clearing directly into my primary account on Monday morning. I will give you all of it, every single cent of his fortune. Keep the extra $6 million as an apology. Just let us live. I swear on my life the money is coming. Just as Ivan tightened his firm grip on the weapon, I reached forward and slammed my hand down heavily onto the main master emergency breaker. The entire house suddenly went completely, terrifyingly pitch black. The sudden absence of light was absolute and suffocating. A heavy, immediate silence hung in the air for a fraction of a second before total chaos erupted directly above me. Shouts of profound confusion rang out loudly in Russian and English. I could easily hear the heavy thud of combat boots scrambling against the imported hardwood floors as Ivan and his armed men momentarily lost their tactical advantage in the pitch-black space. Then I deliberately initiated the primary sequence. I flipped the red toggle switch on the central control panel, activating the secondary emergency protocol I had personally designed when I constructed this fortress years ago. A deafening, high-pitched siren immediately began to wail throughout the entire estate. It was a piercing, physical sound, designed specifically to disorient home invaders and completely mask the mechanical groans of the defensive architecture shifting into place. Above my head, the grinding of heavy industrial gears echoed loudly over the blaring security sirens. I watched the infrared security feeds with a feeling of grim, absolute satisfaction. Thick panels of reinforced ballistic-grade steel began sliding rapidly down over every single exterior window and door. They slammed into their heavily reinforced floor locks with a series of thunderous metallic crashes that physically shook the very foundation of the massive house. These were not standard commercial security measures. They were military-grade barriers. I had installed them years ago to turn this beautiful lakefront property into an impenetrable vault in the event of a catastrophic emergency. Derek had always mocked me relentlessly for this specific financial expenditure. He called it the paranoid indulgence of an old man clinging to ancient mentalities. He never realized that his own arrogant mockery would eventually become the very architect of his physical imprisonment. The heavy steel shutters locked firmly into place, completely sealing the grand living room from the outside world. There was absolutely no way out. The house was now a hermetically sealed, inescapable cage. On the glowing thermal cameras, the scene in the living room quickly devolved into pure, unadulterated panic. The 5 massive mercenaries raised their suppressed weapons, their laser sights cutting sharp, frantic green lines through the absolute darkness. They were sweeping the expansive room, desperately searching for a physical target they could not immediately see. Ivan barked harsh guttural commands to his men, furiously demanding they find the backup electrical generator. They moved blindly, violently, kicking over expensive designer furniture and sweeping their gun barrels wildly across the dark open space. Monica was screaming hysterically, letting out a continuous high-pitched wail of pure, unfiltered terror. She had curled herself into a tight, trembling ball on the floor directly behind the white designer sofa, desperately trying to physically shield herself from the heavily armed men pacing mere inches away from her. Derek was frozen perfectly still, in the exact center of the vast room. He had dropped heavily to his knees, his hands pressing tightly against his ears to completely block out the deafening roar of the blaring security sirens. The arrogant hedge fund manager who had calmly orchestrated my murder was now fully reduced to a whimpering, terrified shell of a human being. I reached out and typed a rapid, complex sequence of encrypted commands into the hidden server terminal. I systematically isolated the audio and visual feeds for the grand living room and quickly routed my personal webcam directly into the primary entertainment system upstairs. I took a deep, steadying breath, staring directly at the small green light, illuminating my camera. It was finally time to permanently resurrect the dead. I confidently pressed the final execution key on the metal desk. In the pitch-black living room, the massive 85-inch smart television, securely mounted above the fireplace, violently flickered to life. The sudden, blinding burst of high-definition white light instantly illuminated the entire room, casting stark, horrific shadows directly against the heavy steel shutters completely covering the windows. The trained mercenaries instantly spun around rapidly, raising their automatic rifles and aggressively aiming them directly at the glowing, illuminated screen. Monica shrieked loudly, scrambling frantically backward across the polished hardwood floor, her eyes incredibly wide with unimaginable, paralyzing horror. Derek slowly raised his heavy head, his trembling hands falling limply to his sides as he stared completely blankly at the massive television. My face entirely filled the large screen. I was sitting perfectly still in the cold, dim light of the concrete utility bunker, staring directly through the camera lens and looking deep into the pathetic soul of my treacherous son. My physical expression was a rigid mask of cold, completely unyielding stone. There was absolutely no lingering fatherly warmth. There was no trace of the generous man who had blindly funded his extravagant, arrogant lifestyle for so many decades. I killed the blaring, deafening sirens with a single decisive keystroke, leaving only the clear sound of heavy, panicked breathing continuously echoing through the silent living room. Derek slowly opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound emerged from his dry throat. His face was entirely drained of healthy color, looking exactly like a man who had just witnessed a genuine ghost stepping directly out of a fresh grave. Monica pressed her shaking hands firmly over her mouth, violently trembling, as she stared fixedly at the bright screen, heavy tears completely ruining her flawless, expensive makeup. Even the deeply hardened mercenaries stood entirely frozen in place, their dangerous weapons slightly lowered in sheer, undeniable confusion as they looked rapidly from the terrified couple to the imposing face broadcasting clearly from beneath their very feet. Garrett stood quietly behind me in the shadows, his arms crossed over his chest, silently watching the brilliant execution of the absolute trap we had built. Ivan stepped slowly forward, lowering his heavy handgun slightly, his cold eyes narrowing as he analyzed the sudden, impossible digital apparition glaring down at him from the wall. He looked directly at Derek, who was still kneeling helplessly on the floor, completely broken by the horrific realization that his entire calculated reality had just completely shattered. "Hello, Derek," I said softly into the microphone, my voice rumbling through the expensive surround sound speakers with dark, absolute authority. "You look incredibly surprised to see me physically breathing tonight. I suppose your highly paid friends in Cambodia encountered a minor logistical problem at the international arrivals gate." Derek let out a weak, agonizing sob, finally realizing the inescapable truth of his situation. He was securely locked inside a massive steel vault with heavily armed killers, and the only person holding the key to his absolute survival was the very father he had explicitly paid to proudly execute. The terrifying realization hit him with heavy physical force. His eyes darted wildly around the dark enclosed space, searching desperately for an exit that simply did not exist. The heavily armed men slowly turned their cold gaze away from the bright screen and locked their dangerous attention entirely onto him. He had absolutely nowhere left to run. He had no money to bargain with. He was trapped in a permanent nightmare of his own arrogant creation, standing completely at my own absolute and unforgiving mercy. The sudden darkness was a physical blow choking the breath out of the room. A chorus of startled shouts and the clicking of automatic weapons being primed filled the void. I waited exactly 3 seconds, allowing the absolute terror of the pitch-black environment to saturate their minds. Then, with a deliberate movement, I pressed the activation key on my control console. The massive smart television above the fireplace flared back to life, flooding the living room with a blinding white glow. The armed mercenaries instinctively raised their weapons toward the screen, their green laser sights dancing across my projected face. Derek was kneeling on the floor, his hands covering his ears, his face contorted in an expression of sheer madness. Monica had wedged herself underneath the glass coffee table, shivering like a trapped animal. Ivan stood perfectly still, his heavy handgun pointed down at my son's head, but his cold eyes were focused on the digital broadcast. "Cambodia has reliable wireless internet, son," I said softly, my voice echoing through the surround sound speakers with chilling clarity. "Good evening, Ivan. I apologize for the dramatic interruption, but I felt it was important to clarify a few operational details regarding your $12 million investment." Derek let out a strangled gasp. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, staring up at my face on the screen. "Dad," he choked out, his voice cracking into a desperate whine. "Dad, please. You have to open the steel shutters. You have to let them out. They are going to kill me. Please open the doors." I looked down at the camera lens projecting an aura of absolute zero. I did not see my son anymore. I saw a parasitic liability that needed to be aggressively liquidated. "You told Ivan that I suffered a tragic accident in the jungle, Derek," I said, my tone perfectly level. "You assured him that you had uncontested legal control of my entire estate, but you were operating on a fundamentally flawed premise. You see, Ivan, my son, is not a financial genius. He is a pathetic coward who uses my money to cover his failures. When the debt became too heavy, he decided to remove me from the equation." I tapped a secondary key on my keyboard. The video feed split in half. On the right side of the screen, an audio waveform appeared. I played the deleted cloud recording at maximum volume. The pristine acoustics of the living room amplified the calculating voice of my son. "The target is boarding the flight on schedule," Derek's recorded voice declared. "He believes he is going on a spiritual retreat. You will meet him at the arrivals gate. A tragically fatal fall near the temple ruins, or a heart attack in the jungle. I do not care. Just make it look natural. I need his death confirmed in 72 hours so the life insurance and trust fund transfer clears before Ivan's deadline." The audio file clicked off, plunging the room back into a heavy silence. Ivan slowly lowered his gun, his eyes shifting from the television screen down to the sweating man kneeling at his feet. The crime boss finally understood the depth of the deception. Derek had not just lied about the repayment timeline. He had arrogantly tried to manipulate a dangerous syndicate into waiting for a murder payout. "He promised you $12 million by next Thursday." I continued speaking directly to Ivan. "He told you that my estate would easily cover the principal debt and a generous penalty fee. He was planning to hand you the keys to my kingdom. But I am afraid my son is entirely bankrupt. He owns absolutely nothing." I switched the screen display, pulling up the digitally notarized documents from Preston Cole. The thick legal text of the irrevocable trust filled the monitor. "Take a very close look at the legal ownership of this property, Derek," I commanded. "Take a look at the portfolio you thought you captured with that fraudulent power of attorney. Because I am demonstrably alive, your legal maneuver was void. Yesterday morning, I transferred every single cent of my $18 million fortune, including the deed to the custom house you are currently standing inside, directly into a locked charitable trust. I am the sole lifetime beneficiary. The capital is legally untouchable by you, by the courts, and by any collection agency." Derek stared at the legal documents on the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The reality of his absolute financial ruin shattered the last remaining fragments of his arrogant delusion. "No," he whispered, shaking his head wildly. "No, you cannot do that. The trust fund, the accounts, the liquid cash, it was all pending. It was right there." "It is completely gone, Derek," I replied, my voice dropping to a harsh rumble. "The house you are standing in belongs entirely to the trust entity. The bank accounts you planned to wire to the Cayman Islands have been hollowed out. Your personal hedge fund is a documented Ponzi scheme, and your operational capital is strictly zero. You are completely broke, and you have absolutely nothing left to pay these incredibly dangerous gentlemen with. Monica let out another piercing shriek from beneath the glass table. She realized the wealthy lifestyle she plotted to steal was nothing more than a mirage. She was trapped inside a cage with heavily armed killers and a husband who possessed zero net worth. Ivan took a slow, deliberate step forward. He reached down and grabbed Derek tightly by the collar of his white dress shirt, effortlessly hauling the terrified man onto his feet. The crime boss pressed the barrel of his handgun brutally hard against the underside of Derek's trembling jaw. "You have wasted an incredible amount of my time, little boy," Ivan growled, his thick accent echoing through the room. "You played a very foolish game. You lied to my face. You promised me money that you never truly possessed. And now you have absolutely nothing left to trade." Derek clawed desperately at Ivan's heavy overcoat, his eyes bulging with sheer panic. He looked back at the massive television screen, completely abandoning any remaining shred of human dignity. "Dad, please," he screamed, raw tears streaming down his flushed face. "Please save me. You have to unlock the trust. You have to pay him. I am your son. I am your own flesh and blood. Please do not let them kill me. Just open the steel doors and give him the money." I looked at the pathetic, weeping creature on the monitor. I felt a cold, dark satisfaction settle deeply into my chest. "You made your choices, Derek," I said softly. "You priced my life at $250,000. Now you must pay your own debts. That is entirely your problem." Just as Ivan cocked the heavy hammer of his matte black handgun, a sudden blinding flash of light pierced through the microscopic gaps in the heavy steel shutters. Red and blue police lights began to reflect wildly across the dark living room walls. The blaring wail of multiple approaching sirens pierced the winter night. The intense strobe of the emergency lights bled through the tiny ventilation grates above the heavy steel shutters, painting the terrified faces of the men inside the living room with alternating flashes of crimson and sapphire. Ivan froze completely. The heavy hammer of his handgun remained locked back, but his cold eyes darted quickly away from my sweating son and toward the sealed exterior walls. The deep, guttural roar of heavy armored vehicles tearing up my manicured driveway completely drowned out the soft crackle of the fireplace. Helicopter rotors began to fiercely chop through the freezing air directly overhead, violently vibrating the thick glass of the reinforced windows hidden tightly behind the impenetrable steel plates. Preston Cole had executed the final phase of our legal counterstrike with absolute, undeniable perfection. While I was busy drawing the ruthless wolves into the cage, my brilliant attorney had quietly contacted the federal authorities, providing them with the massive mountain of encrypted digital evidence we had carefully extracted from Derek's hidden servers. The violent syndicate was officially cornered. The hardened mercenaries instantly realized they had walked blindly into a meticulously coordinated federal trap. They slowly lowered their suppressed weapons frantically, looking toward Ivan for a desperate command that would simply never come. They were heavily armed, but they were certainly not foolish enough to engage in a suicidal firefight against a fully mobilized tactical unit. Derek collapsed entirely onto the expensive hardwood floor, his crisp white suit completely soaked in his own cold, terrified sweat. He scrambled forward rapidly on his hands and knees, completely ignoring the shattered glass of the champagne flute that ruthlessly tore into his soft palms. He crawled directly toward the massive television screen, his pale face twisted into an agonizing mask of absolute despair. He frantically slapped his bleeding hands against the cold surface of the large monitor, leaving smeared red handprints directly across the smooth glass. The imposing, inescapable reality of his total defeat finally broke his arrogant, entitled mind completely in half. "Dad," he screamed loudly, his voice completely raw and breaking into pathetic, ragged, uncontrollable sobs. "Dad, please listen to me right now. You have to immediately open the heavy doors You have to tell them it was all a terrible misunderstanding. You have to save me. I am your only son. I am your own flesh and blood. They brutally forced me to do this. Ivan and his men, they made me take the stolen money. They made me hire those dangerous people in Cambodia. I never truly wanted to hurt you. I love you, Dad. Please, I am desperately begging you on my hands and knees. Just press the button and open the steel shutters. Let me out of here safely. I will do absolutely anything you want. I will loudly confess to whatever they say. Just do not let them take me away into the dark. Please save your only child. I sat absolutely motionless in my cold metal chair inside the subterranean concrete bunker. I looked at the pathetic, groveling, miserable creature loudly weeping on my high-definition monitor. I did not feel a single solitary ounce of paternal sympathy. I did not feel the familiar foolish urge to protect him from the severe consequences of his own disastrous actions. The deep love I once held for him had been systematically and permanently eradicated by his treacherous, insatiable greed. I leaned slightly forward toward the glowing camera, ensuring my cold, completely unyielding gaze pierced directly into his wild, panicked eyes. You are fundamentally mistaken about the current state of our relationship. Derek, I said slowly, my voice echoing smoothly and calmly through the pristine living room speakers. You violently and intentionally severed our familial bond the exact moment you deliberately placed a monetary value on my breathing life. I am no longer your caring father. I am simply a rational man, protecting his hard-earned legacy from a desperate, grossly incompetent thief. I watched closely as his tear-stained face crumpled in utter, profound devastation. You arrogantly assumed I was obsolete. I continued gently, my tone dropping to a quiet, terrifying, completely emotionless whisper. You laughed openly with your treacherous wife and confidently called me a clueless old man who was too mentally blind to understand the modern world. Well, Derek, you were absolutely right about one specific thing. I am just a clueless old man. And unfortunately, I simply do not know how to operate these complicated steel doors. I firmly pressed the termination key on my console. The massive television screen in the living room instantly snapped to dead black, permanently cutting off my live transmission and violently plunging them back into the chaotic, disorienting shadows, lit only by the frantic flashing of the police lights outside the windows. I reached out quickly and triggered the main entryway release protocol. The heavy steel shutters blocking the massive front doors suddenly retracted upward with a loud mechanical screech, sliding smoothly into the reinforced ceiling. The heavy wooden doors, already splintered and ruined by the syndicate's initial violent breach, were forcefully kicked open by the federal tactical team. A dozen heavily armed officers flooded aggressively into the grand living room, moving with overwhelming, practiced, terrifying precision. High-powered tactical flashlights cut fiercely through the darkness, completely blinding the disoriented mercenaries. Deafening, overlapping commands to drop all weapons echoed rapidly over the chaotic, overwhelming din. Ivan and his men knew they were entirely hopelessly outmatched. They immediately dropped their dangerous automatic rifles onto the floor, slowly raising their empty hands high into the air in a silent, reluctant gesture of total surrender. The officers moved swiftly, ruthlessly, tackling the massive men to the ground and forcefully securing their thick wrists with heavy plastic restraints. Monica was dragged out from underneath the shattered glass coffee table, violently kicking and screaming wild obscenities as two federal officers forcefully pinned her arms behind her shaking back. Derek did not resist the authorities. He remained frozen on his bloody knees, staring completely blankly at the silent television monitor as a tactical officer roughly grabbed his trembling shoulders and slammed him face down onto the hard floor. I watched the entire beautiful operation unfold silently on my secondary security monitors. The federal agents methodically cleared the large room, hauling the dangerous Russian mobsters, my treacherous daughter-in-law, and my broken son out into the freezing, unforgiving winter night. I slowly reached into the lower drawer of the metal desk and retrieved a heavy crystal tumbler and a sealed bottle of expensive aged scotch. I unscrewed the cork and poured a generous measure of the dark amber liquid. The rich, smoky aroma quickly filled the cold, sterile air of the hidden bunker. I leaned back comfortably in my chair, holding the heavy glass firmly in my right hand. I watched the red and blue lights gradually fade away into the deep distance, carrying the toxic remnants of my past life away forever. I took a slow, deep sip of the scotch, letting the warm liquid burn very smoothly down my throat. The large house was finally quiet, and my legacy was completely, perfectly, and permanently secure. 3 months passed since that freezing Friday night. The transition from winter into the thaw of spring mirrored the shift within my life. The suffocating weight of my son's treacherous deception had finally lifted, replaced by a cold, immaculate clarity. I found myself standing on the wide, imposing granite steps of the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago. The morning air was crisp and clean. The stone pillars of the building rose high above me, representing the finality of the entire situation. I adjusted the lapels of my overcoat, taking a deep breath of genuine freedom. The dark storm had passed, leaving behind a clean landscape, ready for a new construction. Derek was currently sitting inside a sterile holding cell just a few floors above me. He was formally facing 25 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for conspiracy to commit premeditated murder, extensive wire fraud, and severe financial extortion. The aggressive federal prosecutors had methodically built an impenetrable, airtight case against him. They possessed the damning audio recording from the hidden cloud server, the comprehensive digital footprint of his offshore financial transfers, and his desperate, frantic communications with the Cambodian mercenaries. During the initial arraignment, Derek had completely broken down. The arrogant hedge fund manager was gone, replaced by a weeping, trembling child. He had desperately attempted to negotiate a favorable plea deal, offering to testify against Ivan and the entire Eastern European syndicate. However, the prosecution genuinely did not need his pathetic cooperation. The meticulous, encrypted evidence Garrett had successfully extracted from the hidden servers was more than sufficient to systematically dismantle the entire criminal operation. My son was completely cornered, stripped of his expensive designer suits, his arrogant posture, and his unearned fraudulent wealth. He was facing a quarter of a century behind reinforced steel bars. Monica was faring no better in the eyes of the law. The beautiful, ruthless woman who had eagerly conspired to liquidate my life was currently facing severe, life-altering accomplice charges. She had foolishly attempted to claim absolute innocent ignorance, tearfully telling the hardened federal investigators that she was merely a naive wife, completely unaware of her husband's morbid financial schemes. The authorities quickly presented her with the high-definition surveillance footage from my living room, clearly showcasing her cold, calculated celebration of my supposed violent demise in the jungle. Her weak, fabricated defense crumbled instantly under the crushing weight of undeniable visual proof. She was formally stripped of every single luxury item she had purchased with my stolen capital. The expensive luxury cars, the massive designer wardrobe, the imported diamond jewelry, all of it was aggressively seized by the federal government to offset the massive financial damages. She lost absolutely everything in the span of a single night, and was currently residing in a cramped, miserable halfway house while awaiting her own criminal trial. She would trade her silk designer dresses for a standard-issued prison uniform very soon. The lavish lifestyle she had been willing to kill for was now just a bitter, fading memory. I stood quietly on the courthouse steps, feeling the warm morning sun slowly chase away the lingering chill of the previous months. Preston Cole stood firmly to my right, clutching a thick, premium leather briefcase containing the final, certified copies of the trust documents. He had navigated the complex legal aftermath with absolute surgical brilliance, ensuring that my name remained entirely insulated from the toxic criminal fallout of my son's horrific actions. The federal judges recognized me as the sole surviving victim of an elaborate, monstrous conspiracy. Garrett stood silently to my left, his vigilant eyes constantly scanning the busy street and the passing pedestrians. He remained my loyal shadow, a man who had proven his undeniable, immeasurable worth when my own flesh and blood had actively plotted to put me in the ground. I looked at the two men standing beside me in the morning light. They were not related to me by blood. They did not share my genetic lineage or carry my distinguished family name. Yet they had stood fiercely by my side during the darkest, most dangerous crisis of my entire existence. They had protected my life, secured my hard-earned legacy, and helped me orchestrate the flawless, beautiful downfall of a ruthless syndicate. I realized in that quiet, defining moment that blood simply does not make a family. True family is forged entirely through unwavering loyalty, mutual respect, and the proven willingness to stand together when the world becomes dark and dangerous. I had permanently lost my biological family, but I had successfully retained my vast, untainted empire, my physical life, and my uncompromising dignity. The profound, suffocating grief of losing a son had eventually morphed into a deep, abiding sense of peace. The son I thought I loved had actually died many years ago, slowly replaced by a greedy, entitled predator who saw my breathing lungs as a minor obstacle to his unearned inheritance. The broken man sitting in the federal holding cell today was nothing more than a dangerous, pathetic stranger. Preston gently touched my shoulder, offering a rare, genuine smile that reached his sharp eyes. "It is completely over, Victor," he said quietly. "The trust is permanently sealed. The legal liabilities are entirely severed. The syndicate is dismantled. You are completely free to move forward without looking over your shoulder." I nodded slowly, extending my hand to firmly shake his. "Thank you, Preston," I replied, my voice steady and resolute. "You are an exceptional attorney and a truly loyal friend. I will never forget what you achieved for me." I turned to Garrett and gave him a silent, respectful nod. He immediately understood the unspoken command and stepped down to open the heavy rear door of my waiting luxury sedan. I slowly descended the wide granite steps, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of my own survival with every single stride. I settled comfortably into the plush leather seat of the car, looking out the tinted window at the towering courthouse one final time. I felt no regret. I felt no lingering sorrow. Garrett seamlessly merged the heavy vehicle into the bustling city traffic. We were not driving back to the secluded lake house. That property was now officially owned by the irrevocable trust, currently being prepared for a highly publicized commercial sale. The substantial financial proceeds would be funneled directly into the philanthropic avenues I had carefully selected over the past 12 weeks. I was preparing to heavily fund multiple legitimate charities, specifically focusing on providing advanced educational opportunities and essential resources for underprivileged youth who possessed the genuine drive and ambition that my own son critically lacked. I was ready to start a brand new, magnificent chapter of my life. I had built a massive fortune with my own two bare hands, pouring decades of sweat, sacrifice, and relentless determination into my corporate empire. I was no longer going to hide it away in the shadows or foolishly save it for an ungrateful, murderous heir. I was going to proudly enjoy the substantial fruits of my own grueling labor. The nightmare was finally over, and the rest of my days belonged entirely to me. If this nightmare taught me anything, it is that a predator does not stop being a predator just because they share your last name. We spend our lives building empires to protect our children, blindly assuming our blood guarantees their loyalty. But greed can rot a soul from the inside out, turning the boy you raised into a stranger willing to sell your life for a paycheck. Never ignore your instincts to preserve a toxic peace. Setting strict boundaries to destroy the family illusion is not cruelty. It is pure self-preservation. Respect must be earned regardless of shared DNA. If my story hit home for you, hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss another real-life lesson. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to survive? Drop your experience in the comments below. I read every single one. Stay strong and stay vigilant.